Hello, everybody. It's very good to be here. Thank you, Marek, for all your help. Thank you, everyone who's made me very welcome. All the unsung organizers, helpers, technicians. This man particularly is an absolute pearl beyond price. Is it just this one here?
Yeah,
okay, grand. So there we have it. That's brilliant. I know you're all tired. I know that your brains are now full of things. I promise only one very small graph, and the rest is pictures. You need to know a couple of things about me, I think. The first thing you need to know about me is I am a heretic. I am a very bad man. I question things and disagree with people, and I'm thoroughly disagreeable and have been ever since I could talk. So that's an important thing. First thing I'm going to disagree with is this idea of values-neutral education. I think that's a nonsensical idea. I think all of us involved in education are full of values that we like to share, values that we like to promote, and values that, quite frankly, have to make sense. An illustrative example for you. If you have a cat and a goldfish and you want to treat them nicely, and you have one goldfish bowl full of water and you have a cushion in front of the fire, it is not a good idea to toss a coin and find out which you put in the bowl and which you put in front of the fire, okay? The goldfish will not like that cushion, and the cat will scratch you. I go further than that and say, if you do treat these two animals fairly, equally, which apparently to some people mean the same thing. To me, they mean completely different things. If you treat them equally and the cat gets shoved into the goldfish bowl, I go as far as to say, you are doing something wrong. It is wrong. It's not just stupid, it's bad. It is morally reprehensible. And the answer to this is knowledge. You need to understand what it is you're dealing with when you're dealing with a cat and when you're dealing with a goldfish. And you need to act accordingly. This is a knowledge and an understanding that leads to a morally responsible behavior. That's a sort of illustrative example I would use with my students all the time when they come to me and say, oh, well, the thing I love about your subject, Leon, my subject is religious and philosophical education, is there's no right answers and there's no wrong answers. And I said, well, actually, you're wrong. There are plenty of right answers. I remember asking one applicant in interview, who led the Hebrews to freedom? They said, oh, that's not the sort of thing I'm talking about. And I said, answer the question, who led the Hebrews out of Egypt? Oh, it's easy, she said, Jesus. So, well, you've got a wrong answer right there, okay? And it is about the subject. So that's one of my heresies. Other heresies include huge doubts about money, huge doubts about growth economics, and possibly most controversially, huge doubts about human rights, which we might talk about later. I think that the Human Rights Declaration is the best bad idea of the 20th century. I think it was the last gasp of paternal colonialism. Why do I think that? Because if you demand rights, you're expecting somebody else to do something about that. Whereas if you turn rights upside down and think instead about responsibilities, then you are genuinely giving people control and autonomy over their lives. Now, this is very controversial, and as I say, we can come back to that if you like. I'm going to talk about the unappealing smells of sacrifice, okay, as it involves values, sustainability, and education. And the last thing you probably need to know about me is why I'm interested in this at all. And a little story might help. When I was young, I'm still quite young, you know, so I love to believe with my grey hair. When I was about to leave school for university, in my naughtiness, I used to go and trespass. I used to go and walk around suburban Liverpool, where I grew up, and I'd jump over fences and walls and climb through holes in places to go where I shouldn't be, where I was not allowed. I'm not like many of the people who've spoken here. I wasn't brought up in the countryside, but I'm not a hard city boy either. I'm from suburban England, you know. It was quite green and it was lots of houses. And one of the green spaces I used to go to when I was a child was an area of woodland. Okay. I used to like going there for all sorts of reasons. It was quiet, nobody else went there, you could find interesting things, you could just do things like set fire to things where people wouldn't really know that it was you. And one day I went there and I found red crosses on all of the trees. Red crosses. Now, I was about 17, I was about to go to university, and I thought, what is anybody painting red crosses on all these trees for? And I went home and I talked to my mum, God rest her soul, and she said, oh, that doesn't sound right, Leon. What were you doing in that forest? You're not supposed to be there. And I said, oh, no, I'm very concerned. So actually she realized that red crosses on a tree meant they were going to chop them down. Now, in my neighborhood, we're in a particularly green area of suburban Liverpool, and every tree is protected by law. You cannot damage any tree in my part of Liverpool without special permission, and if you do it without special permission, you have to pay a fine of several £100s. I said, oh, great. And so my mum said, you should phone the council and say they're planning to chop these trees down. And so I did. That was a very interesting experience for me, and I got involved politically and actively in protecting a green space, and I thought that's a triumph. A year later, I went back, and not all of the trees, but most of the trees had been cut down. In their place had been built very large, very desirable houses, almost all of which are occupied by footballers, and very expensive houses. And of course, a house, a lovely detached house in a green part of Liverpool, handy for Liverpool FC and Everton. You'll be familiar with these people, perhaps. They were all occupied by footballers. Now, what had happened? Well, somebody had done the maths. They had done the maths and said, you know what? We can afford to pay the fine for every single tree. It's only £200 for every tree, and we only have to chop 10 or 20 trees down to build every house. And we're selling these houses to footballers, so they can afford to pay the fine as part of the price of the house. And that was, I learned more, I suppose, from that incident than I learned in my first year at university. I learned something very profound and very troubling about the system that we are living in. And it is that system, the money system, the system of money supported by a system of law, that has stayed with me ever since. And it is that system that I'm going to be a little critical of and skeptical about today. But as I've framed this, it is not a work of despair. It is a hopeful response to a very complex set of crises facing us today. Now, this illustrative picture is a picture I've taken to start us off, I suppose, illustrates one of my great loves. It's a love of walking through cities. I like walking in the country as well, but I love walking through the city and finding funny little things. That idea of going where you're not supposed to, where I always used to do when I was a child, has never left me. And I've taken to walking, exploring abandoned spaces, and finding beauty wherever I can. And this is an example of a photograph I've taken of some moss just growing on a wall near a canal in Glasgow. And I see this presence of nature, this presence of beauty in otherwise ignored cityscapes as a touchstone, a little gem that I feel very privileged to own, an ability to see this beauty where others just walk past. A friend of mine once said that the thing they liked about me was my endless capacity to keep myself amused. And I thought, oh, I like that. Yeah, I think that's me. Yes, I can do that. So I love that. So it's a hope in nature, but not in the wild, in just the common areas of the city is a very hopeful thing for me. I see in this moss a power, a resilience to adapt to the most unpromising places in the city. This is the only graph. I say we're in a difficult set of circumstances. Here are the difficult circumstances. The population of the world is growing. It is growing exponentially. We've seen and heard and thought about these figures a lot over the last few days. It is a challenge. And of course, hovering over this challenging background is this ever-present threat of environmental catastrophe. Naomi Klein, the Canadian academic, has just published a book last year, This Changes Everything, which I think is a key text. If you haven't read Naomi Klein's work, I would thoroughly recommend it. She's very readable, very insightful, and she is very positive, which I like. But her positive responses to the threatened environmental catastrophe are perhaps a little questionable. They perhaps are too influenced by environmental activists such as this chap, Dr. Stephen Best. I've described him here as not a cheery person. That's an understatement, I think. Now, I've had a quotation from Stephen Best from his book, The Politics of Total Liberation. Now, I'm sure many of us agree that total liberation sounds like quite a good thing. Freedom is a nice thing. Freedom is something that we've fought to defend and fought to extend to people. And I'm absolutely not going to be critical of freedom. But what I would urge everyone to be skeptical about is the particular uses certain political, philosophical thinkers make of these ideas of liberation and freedom. Now listen to what Stephen Best has to say about what total liberation is. He, I believe, rightly contextualizes this century, the 21st century, as a decisive moment in human history. Naomi Klein says this is the last decade of opportunity. This is the window which will close within 10 years if we don't actually act radically now to change our attitudes and behaviors. Then the opportunity is lost. Okay, well, we'll see what we can do about that. Now, Stephen Best, however, says our actions will determine whether the future will be merely burdensome or catastrophic. Now, there's a choice. I said he was a cheery person. Overcoming this crisis demands a new politics of total liberation that unites the disparate movements for animal, human, and earth liberation. That sounds good. That sounds very good. I like that. Let's make connections between all of these movements for liberation, human liberation, animal liberation, earth liberation. So far, so good. Avoiding bravado or false optimism, I question humanity's ability to rise to the occasion. I dare to imagine a world without us. Sorry? Here's a quotation. We are not terrorists, but we are a threat. We are a threat both economically and philosophically. Now, I like him here. It's good. We're economically threatening and philosophically threatening. He sounds like a good sort of stir up trouble, ask difficult questions sort of chap, okay? Our power is not in the right to vote, but in the power to stop production. Sorry, what? Hang on. We will break the law and destroy property until we win. Now suddenly I'm going off him. I think, hang on a minute. You know, it's all very well to object to the sort of obsessive, extractive industries that Naomi Klein is very rightly, properly critical of. Very right to be skeptical about whether we should be going and ripping up the rare earths to supply just another new phone. But to stop production, destroy property until we win? Sounds a bit odd. He goes on. If we cannot learn how to live harmoniously on this planet, and by harmoniously, I take it he means destroying property, stopping production and breaking law, so fine, then we do not deserve to live at all. Now, this guy is supposed to be a green thinker, a thinker for sustainability. And this is where I really part company with him. If we can't learn how to live harmoniously on this planet, we don't deserve to live at all. This is now a fundamental axiom for me. Now, I think we've heard that sort of thing before. We've heard it before in North Korea from Pol Pot. We've heard it before from Nicolae Ceausescu. And here they are, sitting together, happily, in what can only be described as an ecological utopia. Okay? Forget the sort of rococo furniture and the heavy carpet and the curtains. Look, it's obviously basically a naturally occurring rainforest in all other respects. And this, on the right, is the inescapable consequence of that sort of attitude. It is the mass production of dead human bodies. Okay, and this is something I think I would refer back to my commitment to not a values-neutral education at all, but a values-informed education. If we are going to say, you know what, Pol Pot and Ceausescu, that's one way of doing things. Let's consider that and give it equal weighting to others. Then we have abandoned every principle of the European Enlightenment. We've got to have some sense that human lives are worth preserving and enhancing and enriching. And that ideas such as let's abolish cities, that's Pol Pot again, or let's abolish all subsistence agriculture and centralize the whole population of Romania into the sort of Soviet blocks which allowed comprehensive surveillance of the population. Now, I don't think any of us in this room think that that's a particularly good idea or a particularly beautiful future to hope for. But if you look at the actions of these men, these are ideologically driven people with a commitment, on Pol Pot's part at least, to green philosophical politics. So I'm going to show perhaps a more hopeful, a more humane way of dealing with green ideas than those. I think at the heart of it, we have to preserve this idea of a sanctity of human life. But like the moss that I showed right at the start, I think that humanity has an extraordinarily resilient quality to it. It's a very beautiful capacity to find joy, pleasure, and life in all sorts of places against extraordinary odds. Now, I was going to get technologically ambitious and show you a wee clip, but just look at this if you're interested in it afterwards. It's a very short introduction to ideas of humanizing city planning on a human scale. So it's a really interesting documentary. But the image says as much about it as you like. The capacity of this young girl to skip merrily, happily, just in a sheer joy of her young life, on a very busy, very polluted, rather disgusting-looking railway line in Dhaka. It's amazing. There is this capacity for joy that is illustrated here, which is the capacity which gives me hope, this resilience of joy, the resilience of just fun and beauty. And I think that if we remember that, and if we remember that actually people having fun in a harmless way is part of what life is all about, then we'll probably be okay. It's not about the imposition and exposition of philosophical ideals. It's all about this. It's having fun. But I'm sure it wouldn't take a rocket scientist or a PhD in ecology to point out ways in which this environment might be improved to allow this girl to skip more happily than she is on a busy, polluted railway track. Now, in my teaching about this, and I teach all sorts of people. I run a 4-year undergraduate teacher education program for specialists in religious education and philosophical education. But I also teach these sorts of ideas to people who are going on to be primary specialists. And it is hugely concerning for me to think very carefully about the images I share with students, the sort of means by which to convey important and often very disturbing ideas. Because the background, the context in which they're learning is characterized chiefly by corruption, violence, poverty. And if you Google image search for these things, you will never be short of really horrific images. And I think that it's very important to resist that temptation to show these things. To me, that seems that you're participating in the culture that has at least contributed to the damage, this obsessive pursuit of things going wrong. The news, as you know, is not what's happening, it's what's gone wrong. And I always get my students to question this, you know. I say, well, you know, do planes crash? Yes, of course they crash. But do they usually crash? Look at the statistics. You never hear about the plane that doesn't crash. You never hear about the journey completed safely and on time. You hear about the disasters, and that informs their reality. That makes them convinced that the world is a dangerous and unreliable place, when the truth is actually completely contrary to that. As a rule, plane travel is safe and reliable. Now, I have to say, I'm not unaware of the irony of taking 4 flights to get to an environmentally sustainable conference, okay? I'm rather uncomfortable with that, okay? 2 flights here, 2 flights back. It seems a little ironic, and I hope that my presence here in some way justifies that extraordinary expense of carbon. But that's an aside. So in looking for images, I think what we need to do in order to communicate the important ideas about this cultural context, find the sort of ideas such as this popular poster about corruption in sub-Saharan Africa. The worm in the apple is an idea. And the idea of corruption with a smiley face, a harmless-looking, friendly worm eating the world, is a starting point far more interesting and powerful, I think, than any amount of horrific, shocking images of the inescapable results of this sort of corruption. I think that we need to be gentle but firm and clear about what we're wanting to communicate to our students, and show them that it is possible to talk about these horrific things without actually horrifying people to the point where they feel helpless. Okay, so this is a very important thing. That said, we cannot turn our back on the realities of the culture, the civilization that we have all been born into. This, the culture of industrial production. Now, it's easy to forget just how new industrialized society is. It's, in terms of human history, it's a very recent innovation. Extraordinarily short amount of time has been spent doing all this damage that we might talk about of pollution and environmental degradation and so on. And if we could borrow this phrase from Maoist China, these great leaps forward that have been talked about and dreamt about in all industrial societies are characterized, I would suggest, almost necessarily by problems. Okay? It is almost to the day 100 years since the first use of poison gas as a weapon of war in the trenches of Ypres. Okay, my grandfather on my father's side fought in that battle and was basically scarred for life from the experience of fighting through that First World War. The great leaps forward in China were characterized by not any attention towards valuing diversity, valuing tradition, seeking wisdom in the indigenous cultures of China, but in a wholesale destruction of everything that had gone before. Anything that characterized traditional Chinese culture is burned. These are not people on the fire, by the way. These are images of Hindu bodhisattvas and dharmic masters, these sorts of things. You'll be familiar with the appalling tragedy of the gas explosion at Bhopal in India. And you will be familiar with the technological developments which have brought us the impersonal extermination of people, perhaps combatants, but certainly some innocents amongst them, in the Gulf Wars that continue to this day. Now, I'm suggesting that these are perhaps inescapable dimensions of an industrial society. I'm suggesting they might be. Bhopal, perhaps the most interesting of these incidents, was always described as an accident. Okay, but we have to be critical about the way this sort of idea is constructed, this accident. An accident suggests perhaps that it's nobody's fault. But I wonder about that, just as I wonder about the fairness of flipping a coin to see who goes in the goldfish bowl. I don't think that is fair, and I don't think Bhopal was an accident. I think it was a reprehensible act of willful folly. It was cheap. It was cheaper to build a plant and not inspect it, to just let it decay, let it explode, because quite frankly, it's a long way from anyone who matters. And this sits very uncomfortably with me. The victims of the Bhopal gas explosion have still not been properly compensated for this. But I put that in amongst these ideas because I think that there's something, that there are important questions to ask about the nature of industrialization, okay? But without jumping to this conclusion to say industrialization is bad and we should all perhaps go back to living in the trees or wherever we lived before industrialization. I don't think it was actually up a tree, but you know, it was certainly an option. These ideas are articulated by Ronald Wright in his very interesting and very persuasive book, The Myth of Progress, which suggests that every single development, every single advance that we've made in society and culture has been, in his phrase, a progress trap. He illustrates it by going back to the Stone Age and saying, as soon as we learned how to effectively and efficiently hunt mammoths, we hunted them to extinction. So that short-term gain of lots of mammoths to eat led to a long-term disaster, no mammoths at all. Okay? And he characterizes quite persuasively almost every technological and industrial development in the history of humankind. And his overall thesis is there. It's a myth of progress. But I think we've heard a lot in this couple of days to suggest that right's just not right, if we excuse that rather unfortunate pun. There are things that actually are better. I think the capacity, for instance, to preserve food through freezing, although people might not like the idea of eating frozen food, they might go, oh dear, no, I'll only eat fresh. Well, I think, actually, no, let's be kind, let's be imaginative, and let's be sympathetic to the technology that allows us to preserve what otherwise would have gone to waste, okay, while people starve. I think, well, you know, you can quibble about the quality of fish. You know, I'm sure that everyone here would prefer a fresh fish to a frozen fish. But these are mistaken areas to focus on. Of course you would prefer a fresh fish to a frozen one, but that's not the choice that freezing technology presents people with in the wider world. It's food or no food. Which would you prefer? Which is better? And I just don't think Wright makes a good case to say, oh, it's all just a progress trap. You know, he's another miserable person. He'd much rather focus on the rather poor quality of the frozen fish in comparison to the fresh one than he would on the infinitely better result of having food rather than having no food. Now, I'm contrasting that, and I don't know the answer to this at all. This idea of an increased quantity of food, I think, is a very good thing. It's unarguable. I think a well-fed person, someone with enough to eat, is in a better situation. I think it's a good thing that someone has enough to eat. I think that's better than someone not having enough to eat. Again, values-laden education. I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm contrasting that with this development in information technology. And I'm intrigued as to the extent to which we might compare the growth in accessibility of information with the growth in accessibility of food. I really don't know what to make of that. Somebody earlier today was talking about the superabundance of information, but the lack of wisdom. I'm wondering whether we can be really wise without enough information. If you really seriously don't know the difference between a cat and a goldfish, you are not going to be in a position to make the right judgment about where to put each animal. So I'm intrigued by the growth of information. I'm very hopeful about the growth of information technologies, but I'm not uncritical about it. Now, the growth in consumption, this is a rather alarming image, is from a Neolithic burial site, a Stone Age people. It was discovered in France, I think, a while back. The reason I'm sharing this with you is this idea of conspicuous consumption, of having more than we need, is not a new thing. These two young women who were strangely violently killed. I mean, there's an awful story that we'll never know behind this. But the thing that I'm interested in is that they are wearing jewelry. Okay, they're wearing necklaces made out of cowrie shells, and they've got bracelets on. And these are tens of thousands of years old, and protected in a ritual way by these antlers over the top of them. Very interesting. And I think that there's something very significant here about human nature. We are not just survival machines. We've always wanted, since prehistoric times, we've always wanted a little bit more than enough. We want to decorate ourselves and perhaps other people. We want more interesting, beautiful things. There's nothing necessary about a cowrie shell necklace, but there it is. It's always been there, and I think that this is really interesting, because if you're critical of consumer capitalism, that's fine. But let's not make the mistake that some thinkers do and say, oh, it's all just come in the wake of industrial production, and it's all this evil plot by manufacturers to make us consume more. Well, it might have that in it, but actually we've got it in us to want more stuff anyway. Now, let's press that. What we're dealing with at the moment is a mindset that probably evolved to hunt big game on the plains of Africa. And we have evolved culturally far faster than our brains and our bodies have evolved to cope with it. And I just don't know the extent to which we are able to change our basic ways of thinking. Okay? Now, I think that we need to understand much more about what is natural to us, understand our nature in an open, honest and critical way. And this is what I encourage my students to think about critically and revisit again and again. What are people really like? I mean, you've got pretty much two choices. They are either greedy self-gratification machines, or they are in the image and likeness of God. We are intelligent and kind. We are born to love each other. I suspect we're a bit of both. I suspect that we are free enough. If we inform ourselves well enough, we are free to choose the better path. Back to values again. Bit more context, given that we always want more stuff, nice things, cowrie shell necklaces, new iPhones, same thing. Our growing population is also growing older. The population of developed countries is growing older, and it's hungrier for resources that are getting scarcer. Now, if you want a hilarious set of images of exasperated hatred of the old by the young, Google baby boomers. Okay, Google image says baby boomers, and there's wonderful agitational propaganda by young people saying, bitterly resenting the sense of privileged entitlement that their parents have. You know, sort of smug people who paid for their houses when their houses cost about £1,000 say, well, I paid for my house. Why don't you get off your backside and pay for yours? Well, because I couldn't in 100 years buy this house that cost you £1,000, because now it's supposed to be worth the best part of £1 million. I mean, it's a very strange situation. But anyway, I'm digressing, so I'm not going to digress anymore. I'm going to crack on. Excuse me. These self-same angry young people who are sometimes criticizing the baby boomers are criticize themselves in turn, saying, oh, You're you're always after this next new thing. And I suppose this is one of our challenges as educators. Well, if we can convince people, and I've put young in brackets because I think it's people in general, that shiny new things that they're really wanting to have will make, these things won't actually make them better. And once again, we get back to this importance of understanding ourselves, understanding people, understanding what it is we really desire, what it is we really need. Okay? We've visited the electric junk many times, this conspicuous consumption and built-in obsolescence. We don't need to rehearse that anymore. One very interesting development of this consumer culture in very recent years has been the growth of what I call a false minimalism, that people who are feel themselves above materialism, saying, oh, just don't buy me things. Don't buy me things, because I'm not a materialist. I want experiences. I want experiences. I'm very skeptical about this, because I think it is, as I say, a false minimalism. What you've got here is a work of a lower secondary pupil who's asked to imagine just how important experiences are as against those awful consumer material goods. But look at the sort of daily joys and experiences that we've got. We've got a lovely meal here, which is presumably not locally sourced. It looks like some sort of culinary disaster. I don't know what it is. We've got, of course, the laptop. We've got a cup of steaming coffee. Yeah, we've got some weights. Lift some weights, that's fine. But the flight to the pyramids, although they're upside down, there seems to be something hugely questionable about whether you are not in some way participating in a rabid, out-of-control consumer culture in your pursuit of one of the world's 50 top experiences. Now, I don't know if you have these books stuffing the shops around your countries, but in Britain we have shelves full of things like 1,000 movies you must see before you die. Oh, the bucket list, these things you must see and do before you die. So imagine if you had a book saying 50 things you must own before you die. People would go, you've got to be kidding. What an absurd idea. No, I am for the experience. Because I'm basically not religious, I'm spiritual. I am feeding myself with experience. So this is a culture of narcissism. This is insanity. This is me, me, me. And crucially, it doesn't make anyone happy. Now, what do you do when you've ticked off all those 50 top experiences? I don't know. Live the rest of your life in a sort of empty disappointment? Thinking, oh, I've done all the best. It's a bit rubbish from now on in. There's a wonderful film, I don't know if you, nobody ever saw it, okay? It was by Nicholas Roeg back in 1983, a film called Eureka. And Nicholas Roeg made brilliant films. Every single one of his films is extraordinary. But Eureka is about a gold prospector. And he's obsessive in his pursuit of gold. And he finds gold near the start of the film. And the rest of the film is misery. Now, I know I'm not making a good sell of that film. It's, oh, yes, an hour and a half of misery, Leon. That sounds like a good night out. But it just shows how extraordinarily powerful disappointment is. That you've got to be careful what you wish for, because you might just get it. And then, what will you do? Now, I've just got my 5 minutes. I'm about halfway through. So I'm going to have to crack on. Big question. how do we go about framing our understanding of sustainability and raise environmental awareness and consciousness amongst our students? Well, we have to bear in mind that there's a context. The context is that the powers that go against sustainability shout very loud indeed. They are slick, they are persuasive, they're attractive. Nobody would buy this stuff if it wasn't nice and exciting, okay? The devil does have the best tunes. Nobody would sin if sinning wasn't fun. Okay, it just wouldn't happen. So we have to acknowledge that. And we have to think carefully about, well, we think that much of our society is heading for the cliff, much like the Gadarene swine in Luke's gospel, possessed by these demons, and they all go rushing off the cliff, a little bit like lemmings are supposed to do. We have to think, well, how are we going to change the mindset? Okay, because at the moment they're in the wrong direction. And in that context of loud shouting, persuasive advertising and so on, the crucial thing for me, at least, for my, when I'm dealing with students, is to draw on the very resources of the consumer capitalist society at its best, because it's not all terrible. Films such as Koyaanisqatsi, films such as Into the Wild, carry incredibly well-made, very persuasive messages, not didactic messages, just thought-provoking images in a thoroughly beautiful, interesting way, which students find engaging and thought-provoking. So use the resources that are available to us. And use the sort of imagery, the slick imagery of consumerism to critique that very culture. This is a slide I used to introduce these ideas to all sorts of student groups. And every time they're asked to look at it, what do you see? What do you think and feel about what you see? It's always interesting to hear how they respond. I've never had a boring response to this image. But the question is, what do people need to flourish? And flourishing is an unfamiliar word to many of them. I usually illustrate that with two images of a house plant. Okay, they understand houseplants, whether they have them or not. They know the difference between a healthy-looking plant and a really ill-looking plant. And the healthy-looking plant is flourishing. And they can do the maths on flourishing. What does the plant need? And they'll easily say, oh, it needs water and light. Yeah, it needs soil, yes. And then we get on to the more interesting stuff, which I'll go to in a minute, okay? Now, here is something that I'm really concerned about. The question as to what we actually want to sustain. And I'm going to have to read this out from the Scottish government, okay? Because Scotland has got this great reputation for, sustaining sustainability education, outdoor education, and so on. And from Education Scotland, the government's website, they say, this is a Scotland where learners are educated through their landscape. And here they are, being educated through their landscape, and understand their environment, their culture and heritage, where they develop a sense of place and belonging to local, national and global community, and have a deep connection to the natural world. Now, this is a notorious party that happened a couple of years ago right next to where I live, in a very beautiful park in Glasgow called Kelvin Grove Park. Now, this, as you see, was not just a few people. This was attended by countless thousands of young people who were displaying very typical behaviours of young Scottish people. They were drinking to excess, they were doing all sorts of interesting things with each other, and this rubbish that they're leaving, which is conspicuous by its absence from Tallinn, so far as I can see, was not picked up after them. They didn't go, oh, we've had our fun, now let's tidy up. They left rubbish and excrement and vomit for someone else to clean up. Now, I think that that is unacceptable. I think that is wrong. And I think that, sadly, that is typical too typical of too much of Scottish youth culture. That's what we're dealing with. And the government document is very naive if it's in denial about that. This is the reality, and that's what we have to shift. It's not that most people in Scotland are somehow unlike this. The trouble is, too many are like this. So, yeah, we're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, and that's what I would introduce them to, so I'm not going to dwell on that. An activity I do introduce them to is a reflective activity. You know, you'd be astonished at this. I asked them, these are undergraduate students, and I asked them in an open hall to think about what they have consumed in the day and what they rely on in the day. And I asked them to make connections, and it's a really interesting sort of hand-holding exercise and making a very physical network. And what that actually throws up is really interesting insights into how little they understand of the world they inhabit. My favorite, because I asked them to say things, well, what did you have for breakfast? Where did that come from? And they'll say, oh yeah, I had cornflakes. So well, where did that come from? How did it arrive? So they have to think about the packaging, and then they have to think about the store. They have to think about the lorry that delivered it to the store, as well as the farmer, and all the rest of it. This network is very complex. And I have to think about, ask them to think, well, what was a lorry made of? So, it's rubber for the tires and metal. And my favorite question that emerged was, well, where does metal come from? These are undergraduate university students, and they didn't know. They did not know where metal came from. They didn't know whether it fell out of the sky or grew on trees or, I don't know, was some sort of strange thing that you open a cupboard and it magically appears. It's so strange. And these are the sorts of activities I recommend to you as a brilliant way of finding out what your students and your pupils don't know. Because when they realize what they don't know, then the fun starts. I've really got to crack on. I'm very, very critical of economics as the measurement of well-being, okay? I'd much prefer Maslow and his hierarchy of needs than I do to economic measures. We've had other people talking about the Club of Rome's limits to growth, so I'm not going to talk about that. Let's think about enough as an idea. It's very seldom used. Okay, the very word enough is very seldom used in advertising because it is anathema to advertising. You never can have enough. Now, just as I say, oh, those Stone Age people, they wanted more than enough. It's a natural part of things. I'm going to go back to that. There is a very important idea that in human evolutionary consciousness, we are probably in a state of dynamic dissatisfaction. It is our natural state of being to be unsatisfied. Now, if we didn't have that part of our nature, we'd probably still be living in the trees or on the savannah or somewhere. We would never have thought about it. So actually, enough is fine, but we shouldn't just say, oh, we've got to impose this as an idea. I'm not going to talk about affluenza because we haven't got time. I need to just move on to the body of this, which I'll do in a minute. Okay? Enough is at the very heart of Aristotelian ethics. You'll be familiar with the doctrine of the mean. If you're not familiar with it, a little exercise I do is ask students to think of someone they think of as good, and then say, what makes them good? Could they be too much of that? And they always go, I suppose you could be too much of that. And that's Aristotle's teaching about ethics in a nutshell. Between too much and not enough is always enough. And that is the path of virtue. It is pretty much exactly the same in Buddhist ethics. The middle way, not too much, not excess, not too little, not asceticism. It's our Western tradition, yes. It's in the Indian tradition, yes. It's right there. What on earth has that got to do with sacrifice? Because that's supposed to be what the talk is about. I've got 30 seconds to do it in. Sacrifice has come to mean this idea that we should give things up. The Christian season of Lent is now characterized by saying, oh, actually, I'm giving up chocolate. Ramadan in Muslim countries is, oh, I'm going to suffer all the way through the day. I'm not going to eat or drink a thing. And come sundown, seriously, in the town squares of some Muslim countries, they're waiting with their fruit, going, it's nearly ready, nearly ready. I think something important has been lost there. That fasting is one way of texturing the world, okay? Giving something up is something very important. We have to think what we're giving up and why we're giving up. And this really is coming to the end, I promise you, Marek. The Hindu gurus talked about knowledge as not adding anything, but taking things away, okay? If you teach someone, you remove ignorance. Ignorance is a stain. Ignorance is like a growth or an accretion that blocks what you are. It's like when Michelangelo was making his sculptures. He said, I'm not making a sculpture, I'm finding the sculpture that is in this stone. It's already in there. All I have to do is take away all the bits that aren't the sculpture, and then I've got it. These things, these stones on the, what's that? That's the right, are fossil corals. Okay, you might be best thinking about the diamonds. Okay, a diamond in the rough is a nice enough thing, but if you cut it, if you take away certain aspects that are unnecessary, you can find a most exquisite jewel inside, not by adding anything. And for teachers, for educators, this idea is very challenging. We're not giving them anything, we're taking away all the stuff they don't need. It's not learning sustainability, it's unlearning all those bad habits of unsustainability. Which brings us to the idea of sacrifice in Hinduism. In Hinduism, for many centuries, societies were centered on the temple. A sacrifice was not when you, and this is medieval Hinduism. Ancient Hinduism, they used to chop things up, okay, and kill things and burn them. Hinduism grew up in the Middle Ages. It started building temples, and temples were the center of society. And no money was exchanged. Everyone in society was employed. If you're a dancer, you danced. If you're a singer, you sang. If you're a musician, you play music. If you're a farmer, you grow stuff. If you're a baker, you take the stuff and you make lovely bread. If you're a cook, you do lovely things. You grow flowers and you thread them. Everyone is employed. Everyone takes whatever they do and they offer it to God. God accepts it gladly and then gives it back. Everyone brings everything they have to the temple. And everyone, whatever their need, comes and takes what they need. It's an extraordinary vision. It's a utopian society, but it existed for hundreds of years in medieval India. And we haven't got time, because I'm already overrunning, to go into why it ended, but, you know, things do. Don't make the mistake of thinking that you have to believe in God to have that sort of sacrificial culture. All you need is a shared idea of what is a good idea, what human flourishing might look like. And there's been lots of little glimpses in this last couple of days about what people aspire to: community, fairness, sharing, education. All of these are lovely things. I've chosen another one of my photographs here to suggest that actually what we need to do is re-sanctify life. I love this sort of image because it takes you through a passageway, a gateway, a window, a doorway. You pass through this and you're still in the same place. But in Japanese Shinto Buddhism, they have ritual gateways. You've probably seen them, red gateways, in special places in the countryside or wherever, and you pass through them, and you are somehow transformed by passing through that gateway, because it's a state of mind that changes. You pass through the gateway, think, I'm somewhere else, but I'm in the same place, but I'm somewhere else now. Something very important is different, because I've made the step from one way of being to another. It's a ritual thing. You don't have to believe in God. You don't have to believe in the spirits of Shinto. You don't have to believe in any of that. All you need is to think, what can I change to make things better? Last little thing. I'm sorry, Marek, I always do this. I have huge hope for the social media world. I was very critical of it, very reticent about it. I only joined Facebook about a month ago. It's true, sorry. I was always thinking, oh, it's people spying on me, like they were interested. And I've realized, actually, no, this is genuinely an interesting possibility of making connections with like-minded people to actually get in touch with people who want to make positive changes in the world. And it's nicer to do it in company sometimes, okay? The things on the right, the chocolate cake in the middle, is the central image I have with all my students on my 4-year program. I say knowledge is not like a chocolate cake. You share the chocolate cake, you've got less cake. You share knowledge, you've still got the knowledge, and they've got it too. Knowledge is something that gets bigger the more you share it. Now that has implications for how I assess students, because, you know, how do you tell that they haven't copied each other? Well, actually, I don't really mind if they do. I think working together and being assessed alone is absolutely fine. The problem on the right is we have this idea that knowledge is somehow a possession, a thing that you have, and that yes, you can share it, but you've still got your piece. I think that that is a very misleading image. I much prefer it's not like cake. The trouble is in our language. Our very language, and yesterday we had this idea that English is a really problematic language. It's a terrible language, because English, unlike say Chinese, insists that things are things and they can somehow be owned. Things are not necessarily things. So we think, and the illustration here is rain. We think, I've seen the rain, as if the rain was a thing. Rain is not a thing at all. Rain is an event. It's part of a process. Everything changes. You might illustrate this now. Let's wake up and hold our hand up and go, right, hold our hand up, everybody, and now clench your fist, okay? Clench it, shake it at the people you don't. Yes, now let it go. Where is your fist? And the trouble is the fist is a thing, but it's not a thing, it's an event, it's part of a process. Now, ultimately, the problem is we've thought of everything in our culture as a thing. Most notably and deplorably, we think of land as a thing, land as something to be owned. If we look back to the Old Testament, we see land cannot be owned. I can't go into the details of that, but the details will be on my notes. What we're looking for, in short, is another great leap forward. This is by a contemporary Chinese artist. I think that the great leap forward has to be unlike any leap we've made before, and it has to be a natural, a curious, and perhaps even, at first glance, a monstrous leap forward. This Godzilla frog might symbolize everything I hope to see in my lifetime. I've massively overrun, and I do apologize for that. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you have a good evening tonight.
We are overrun, but we still take questions. At least I have several, but please, yes. Right. Yeah.
Just a short comment. You mentioned about this behavior of people gathering in the landscape, and this is not unique to Scotland. I am from Poland, from Krakow, and there was an event in the suburbs, the area of former limestone quarry, which is now area of interesting landscape and natural beauty. And there was an event on Facebook that people were gathering and also left a lot of rubbish, and it was not registered gathering, and there were some legal problems and so on. So it's unfortunately nothing unique.
I saw your presentation earlier, and it was a question I wanted to ask you about. Maybe we could chat after about how best to manage that. Thank you for that.
Any other? Yes.
Actually, I hope I understood well that you see religiosity actually as a part of our nature. Can you define it a bit? As you do in your own way.
Sorry,
religiosity. Yes.
I do. Insofar as we have, I believe, I think there's two dimensions here, at least two dimensions. I think that there is a moral dimension. And it's very easily established that you don't need religion to be moral. That's a no-brainer. It's widely believed, and it's widely believed, and I think wrongly, that morality is always socially constructed, and that's all there is to it. And I don't think that's right. I think the work of Mark D. Hauser in his work called Moral Minds clearly demonstrates that there is a moral instinct to us. So that takes us right back to the idea of the cat and the goldfish. Nobody in their right mind would seek to make either of those animals suffer. They don't want. There is a real difference, in my view, between kindness and cruelty, and it is our instinct, which I think is a religious instinct, a desire to honour living things. I think that that's part of it. I think I'd go further, and I would suggest that I think that there is a sense of the sacred that we are all more or less capable of accessing, and we access it in times of quiet. Often, I suppose, in this company, I would go as far as to say, I'd guess a lot of people here would access a sense of what they might call the sacred or the holy in places of nature. And I think that there is something profoundly important and real in that sense that there is something valuable in beauty. And I think that this is where I frame my sense of human religiosity. What I don't do is locate religiosity within dogmatic religious structures, although I think that dogmatic religious institutions have contributed enormously positively to human civilization throughout history and throughout the world. I'm not uncritical of them, but I am not hostile to them either. I think does that answer your question? It seemed to be going round a bit. Is that all right? It's a very interesting question, a big answer. Maybe we could talk later as well.
Thank you. I use my power and ask the last question myself. You mentioned that the answer is in the knowledge. It was the thesis of yours. So, but I'm an ecologist. I'm a natural scientist. I believe in evidence. I believe in facts. I believe in knowledge. But I'm sure there are people who would say there is no knowledge. That it's all about opinion and construction. There are no facts.
Well, I'm rather keen on Dr. Johnson, that great English curmudgeon. I think his response to Bishop George Berkeley, the early idealist, who was a precursor of the postmodern conviction that there are no facts. Berkeley said, it's all only ideas, And he basically went and kicked him and said, thus I refute Berkeley. I just kicked you, deal with it. That's a fact. So I think, I don't think that there's this idea that everything is all factual. I think that particularly postmodern thinkers have contributed enormously to our richer understanding of perspectives. I think that this insight that the way, for instance, Zulus experienced their wars against the British are going to be very different from the way the British talk about the wars against the Zulus. I mean, and the idea of walking down the street as a big man, I'm 6'3" and I'm all right, I'm from Liverpool and I'll finish any fight, you know, so I'd love to believe. My experience of walking down the street in Glasgow is very different from that of my 5'3", slightly built female student, who, you know, is going to see the world very differently. And I think that it is postmodernism that has given us a proper conceptual framework to appreciate the validity of different perspectives from race, from gender, from age, from ability, and all of this. But I still think they're facts. I think that the facts redacted through experience. To doubt the experience of an objective reality that is variously interpreted is going back to Bishop George Berkeley's idea that you know, we all are ideas in the mind of God. I don't think it really works. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. And we can continue later on.
Good.
So thank you very much.